This is Audible. From the series and Volume 1 of The Unseen City, Salazar'S Touch. The Chosen. A fictional, summarized biography of the man known as Charles the Great, / Charlemagne / Marco Polo / Keanu Reeves, by Kevin B. Keanu Reeves gazed into the mirror, envisioning himself as King Charlemagne. It had been centuries since he last bore that name, but that was when it all began, when the Empress had cursed him with immortality. Through 8 different lives, he had evolved before becoming the Keanu Reeves the world now knew. As an actor, still secretly engaged in some of his past passions, he had finally begun to enjoy life once more. The Sleeping Giant, The Unseen City, and for the more pessimistic, The Fortress of Icy Solitude. These are some of the names I have heard used to describe my beloved City of Ottawa. A city so vast that it has its own municipalities, yet so humble that, despite hosting the headquarters of national defense, the RCMP, CICS, the OPP, and the parliamentary police, it remains quiet amid the fray. Never boastful, never loud, never forceful, but always indispensable. Like the Mongols of the 1200s, we compete against each other, but with the evolution of civility. Unlike the Mongols, there is no bloodshed, perhaps some hatred as with every conflict or society, but the people of Ottawa have always been reluctant to choose violence against one another. And just as the Mongols, despite their vast expanse, maintained a strong sense of unity, so do we. If you have lived in Ottawa for more than a year, it is difficult not to become its protector. Both the haves and the have-nots recognize that the city offers a sense of calm, a family-oriented environment, and constant security with patrol cars passing through every neighborhood at least 2 to 3 times per hour. The crime rate is low, almost non-existent, or so the authorities would have us believe. For any society plagued by crime and the fear it brings, regardless of wealth, is a problem for its residents. But we often forget or remain unaware of the presence and power of criminal entities. Despite Ottawa's safe and welcoming image, it does not mean a lack of crime, criminal organizations, or conspiracies. Unlike many other North American cities where gangs battle for territory through violence, Ottawa is unique. For nearly 400 years, a heavily enforced yet perplexing decree has governed its underworld, one known only to the leaders of the city's criminal organizations. This unwritten law is simple. Ottawa is off-limits for illegal activities, save for communication and succession planning. Blood is not to be spilled unless sanctioned by the decree's designated keepers. No unauthorized shipments of drugs or weapons may cross its borders. All inter-gang disputes are mediated and settled by these keepers, who are typically clergymen, once men of the streets, now men of the cloth. Though laws are rigid by nature, over the centuries, this decree has been subtly adjusted, offering some discretion to its enforcers. Though loosely defined, these laws have always been honored by those at the helm of the city's criminal organizations. Their subordinates obey the rules, yet remain ignorant of the decree's origins, once known as the Laws of Salazar. The name Salazar is whispered only among a select few, those in power, and those who have perished for violating the decree. Like many great men, Salazar has slipped through the cracks of history, leaving behind no official title or political standing. No one truly knows who he was, yet every resident of Ottawa unknowingly benefits from the actions he took centuries ago. The unspoken bylaws he established continue to maintain the peace and order we so effortlessly enjoy. Salazar is the only man of whom it can be said, "Those before us knew him, those after us will know him, and though we all know of him, we do not know him." If that statement seems perplexing, rest assured, so is the rest of the lore of Salazar. Salazar was a reserved man, a simple fur trader who showed little interest in wealth. He sought only a modest shelter and a comfortable life. Unlike many, he arrived at Ottawa's borders with no aspirations for fortune, no desire for family, and no hunger for power. He had forbidden himself from indulging in such dreams, haunted by the conquests of his past. This narrative will briefly explore the past, fictitious lives and present existence of Salazar, formerly known as Charlemagne, or Charles the Great, once Emperor of Rome and King of the Franks. It is rumored, though unconfirmed, that he later assumed the identity of Marco Polo, serving the Mongol Empire under Kublai Khan, grandson of the legendary Genghis Khan. From 801 AD to the present, Charles the Great, Salazar, or, as he now calls himself, Mr. Keanu Reeves, has continuously reinvented himself, bearing witness to both peace and turmoil across the ages. As the only functional immortal, he has played a hand in shaping world history, though his most recent persona has spent the last 50 years entertaining us on screen. The irony is striking. The world's second greatest trickster, the devil being the first, becoming a movie star. He has been a soldier, a scholar, a king, an envoy of the Mongols, and even a hidden figure in the South African anti-apartheid movement, allegedly teaching Mandela's followers the art of explosive resistance. While Mandela insisted he remain in the shadows for the movement to remain a black-led struggle, Charles was content to be unseen. In his time, Charlemagne was an iconic leader, a man whose conquests led to the first true attempt at a unified Europe. Ruler of the Carolingian Empire, King of the Franks, a people named for their ferocity, King of the Lombards, and ultimately, with the aid of an exiled pope, Emperor of Rome. Despite his love for education and the arts, he reserved these privileges for the nobility. His legend spread across the known world. The emperor of the Tang dynasty sent an envoy requesting Charles act as a mentor to his 11-year-old heir. Though flattered, Charles initially declined. But 3 years later, on a whim, he set sail for China, eager to see his young charge and assess new lands for their strengths and vulnerabilities. Even as a mentor, he was still a king, always considering his empire's future. It was 805 AD. Charles secretly informed the Tang dynasty of his journey, providing false routes to throw off enemies and spies. While others awaited him elsewhere, he and his personal guard, trained killers all, disguised themselves as pilgrims and took a treacherous route through hostile lands. To reach China, even as an emperor, he had to traverse raging seas, burning deserts and perilous jungles. His greatest strength lay in his ability to forge alliances with the rulers and people he met. Standing at 6 feet and 3/4, he was a formidable presence, blessed with the build of a warrior and the charisma of a leader. Dressed in the traditional garb of the Franks, a linen shirt and breeches beneath a fringed tunic, he carried himself with unwavering authority. His long white hair served as a natural crown, a symbol of royalty wherever he traveled. His oval face, piercing eyes, and sharp nose commanded attention, while his powerful voice inspired both awe and admiration. He groaned, stretching until his spine cracked. Age had begun to weigh on him, his body less forgiving than in his youth. They had been traveling for weeks through the desert, nearing the Arab Empire on their way to the Pew City States. But the burden of power brought with it an old companion, insomnia. Charles, as always, struggled to sleep. Years of battle and travel had honed his senses to the point where even the faintest sound could rouse him from sleep. Only alcohol could lull him into slumber. But in unfamiliar lands, dulling his senses was a risk he couldn't afford. After months on the road, they finally reached the Pala Empire, in what is now modern-day India. Though not an ally of Charles the Great or the Roman Empire, the Pala rulers were well aware of the power Charles wielded, as both Roman emperor and king of the Franks. Emperor Gopala had been informed that Charles and his men would be passing through his territory, en route to the Tang dynasty. However, the message arrived too late. By then, Charles and his men were already deep in Pala lands, unknowingly traveling along a path that ran 100 acres from the empire's royal burial grounds. Though time has blurred the details, it is said that as Charles and his men journeyed through a dense forest, they came upon a Bengal tiger in pursuit of a native woman. In a moment of sheer audacity, Charles turned his horse and charged toward the beast. His men followed, though delayed by hesitation, and they watched as their emperor, still clad in his Frankish garb, leaped from his horse, sword in hand, and thrust himself forward, the blade aimed directly at the startled tiger's torso. Landing atop the wounded creature, Charles drove his sword into the tiger repeatedly, ensuring its death. His men, upon reaching him, stood in silent admiration, awed and filled with pride. They had just witnessed their leader slay a Bengal tiger with nothing but a sword. The tale would later echo through the halls of Rome, though details of the weapon and the brave steed would be conveniently omitted. Amidst their celebration, the woman Charles had saved collapsed into a fit of anguished wailing. With tear-soaked hands, she crawled toward the slain tiger, gently cradling its head as she sobbed. Just as Charles reached out to console her, royal guards descended upon them, taking them to Emperor Gopala. After formal introductions, Gopala informed Charles that the woman he had encountered was not only one of his wives, but also the royal court sorceress. What he did not reveal was that she had been in mourning for her son, who had died just 4 nights earlier. Nor did he mention that the tiger Charles had slain was no ordinary beast. It was the Empress's cherished pet, raised from a cub and regarded as a member of the royal household, akin to a beloved dog. So when the Empress insisted on blessing Charles for saving her life, neither he nor his men suspected treachery. Instead of bestowing a blessing, she cursed him with eternal life. Though he would die like any other man, he would always rise again. Performing rituals steeped in ancient magic, she sacrificed several animals, a practice not unfamiliar to the Romans, before uttering a final incantation over Charles. Out of curiosity rather than courtesy, he complied. At first, Charles's translator dismissed her words as the ramblings of a grateful empress. But after deeper reflection, he approached his emperor with concerns. Charles merely laughed, joking that if he had truly been cursed, it was more of a blessing. Yet only a few years later, on January 28th, 814 A.D., Charles the Great, Charlemagne, died at the age of 66. But within 24 hours, he awoke, seemingly younger. Reportedly, he laughed hysterically for hours, and those who witnessed it feared he had gone mad. By then, no one knew of the curse except Charles himself, and the only acceptable explanation short of calling their emperor a devil, was that he had been divinely chosen to rule forever. But Charles had other plans. With his final imperial orders, he swore those who had seen his resurrection to secrecy, rewarding their silence with land and titles. From the shadows, he oversaw the crowning of his son, Louis the Pious, ensuring his transition to power. Though Charles had already named Louis as his successor in 813, he knew conspiracies lurked, requiring his unseen hand before he could disappear into the world. Determined to make the most of his second life. Through centuries of reinvention and trial, Charles became adept at operating from the shadows while maintaining a public persona. However, he now admitted that being Keanu Reeves would be difficult to walk away from. Plastic surgery had come a long way, but even so, the life he had built as an actor over the last 40 years would be challenging to abandon. Which brings us to today. It's 2022. For the past 4 decades, Charles the Great has lived as an actor, an unusual choice for someone who once ruled vast empires and was worshipped as an envoy of Christ. But acting allowed him to influence the masses through art while finally living in the light, no longer hidden behind the legacies of other great men. Yet Hollywood's cutthroat nature had left a bitter taste in his mouth. The industry's bloodthirstiness disgusted him, and though he remained selective in his projects, he only accepted roles that allowed him to experience a life or character he had yet to live. Centuries earlier, after the death of Genghis Khan, Charles had rekindled his interest in humanity, tracing and monitoring his lineage. While he ensured the well-being of his descendants, he only intervened if he deemed them worthy. He watched them from afar, using paid operatives to observe and, when necessary, interfere. But he had no tolerance for those who succumbed to their darker instincts. Any descendant who exhibited a penchant for violence or cruelty was either abandoned or eliminated. Over the centuries, Charles had witnessed more suffering and human indifference than any living being. He had accepted the world's nature, but was determined that his bloodline would not contribute to its darkness, and so he tracked, observed, and acted only when necessary. Though he tried to remain detached, he had favorites. Among his many descendants, some captured his attention more than others. Often those dealt a cruel hand in life. For these few, he intervened from the shadows, subtly altering their fates for the better, though they never knew the true identity of their mysterious benefactor. It was no surprise, then, when Charles received an urgent call from his assistant during one of his solitary retreats. He had just wrapped filming the latest John Wick sequel and had taken to the Amazon rainforest for one of his post-film excursions. Living in a small town near the Pantanal for the past 6 weeks, he had been trekking through the jungle with his 2 monstrous, drug-enhanced Con Corsos, Dread and Hades, seeking the quiet of nature, a respite from the modern world. He no longer feared death, having met it countless times, yet it refused to claim him. His love for the Amazon ran deep, not least because 2 centuries ago he had been swallowed whole by an anaconda, spending 2 agonizing months trapped in the belly of the beast. In all his immortal years, that experience had been the closest thing to death. But this retreat was cut short when his assistant relayed shocking news. One of his favorite descendants had come into possession of an extremely rare, highly sought-after pink diamond known as the Rose. Coincidentally, the young woman, his distant relative, was also named Rose. A woman in her early 30s, she bore the slender nose and long face of her Frankish lineage. Her striking beauty was accentuated by an almost Grecian elegance. Her blonde hair streaked with silver strands. Charles had watched over her since birth, ensuring her well-being from afar. When her parents perished in a car accident, he had intervened more directly than usual, placing her in an orphanage where she was, at first, the only child. To prevent loneliness, he later introduced other orphans, ensuring she had friends while remaining unaware of the invisible hand guiding her life. So when Rose inadvertently acquired the rose, Charles knew it was no accident. Someone had orchestrated this event, someone who understood his history. The diamond was a message, a peace offering of sorts, comprehensible only to him and his proxies. But innocent Rose would remain oblivious. Understanding the implications, Charles cut his retreat short. Within 24 hours, he was extracted from the Amazon, flown to Rio, and on his way to Ottawa. He had always had a soft spot for Rose. She was the mirror image of his mother, a face he had not seen in thousands of years, now reborn in her. And now, someone had found her, someone who knew too much, and that could not be ignored. When Rose's parents passed away in 1988, Keanu resided in Ottawa for several months, working diligently to establish an orphanage for her. Beyond that, he was resolute in ensuring the child would grow up in a city that remained a bastion of relative safety and order. That same year, Keanu orchestrated the most significant gathering of international crime syndicates in history. Having lived for centuries, he leveraged his vast network to summon the leaders of the world's most notorious criminal organizations into a single room. To entice their attendance, he presented them with lavish gifts from his collection, priceless antiquities and treasures of gold and silver. The offerings were substantial enough to capture their attention, compelling them to listen to this enigmatic stranger. In what was described as a blistering address, Charles congratulated each leader on their regional dominance, displaying an unnerving depth of knowledge about their operations. He spoke of their most trusted allies, the precise locations of their mistresses and lovers, and the inner workings of their organizations. He made it clear that he knew everything about their lives. Then, with undeniable visual proof, he revealed his immortality, ensuring he commanded their full attention. Over the next few hours, Charles laid out a new doctrine for the criminal underworld. He had no desire to alter their business operations, but was adamant about preserving Ottawa as a neutral ground. No criminal enterprises were to take root within the city. Instead, it would serve as a sanctuary for meetings and leadership transitions. Ottawa would remain sacred under the name Salazar. This decree had remained in effect for 34 years, with only 2 infractions, both from organizations that attempted to establish operations within the city. Their leaders were swiftly dealt with. Their dismembered bodies were delivered to their peers as a stark warning, each accompanied by a chilling note that read, "Salazar still watches." Salazar had returned, not as Keanu Reeves, but as Charles the Great, the undying legend. That night, he met with Pastor Frank, his proxy in Ottawa, and the unofficial guardian of Rose, who regarded him as an uncle, despite knowing he was merely a shrewd and enigmatic man of faith. Charles's assistant had arranged accommodations for him at the Westin Hotel on Rideau Street. Unbeknownst to Pastor Frank, Rose had recently come into possession of a rare diamond, known as the Rose. Though he had never encountered Salazar in person, Frank knew of the legend, and the moment he realized Salazar had learned of the diamond before he had, an uneasy fear settled in. To Frank's surprise, the meeting with his legendary employer was uneventful. Charles issued a series of precise instructions to ensure Rose received the full proceeds from the diamond sale. It became increasingly clear to Frank that Salazar might have orchestrated the entire ordeal. He arrived with a meticulously detailed plan. Bank accounts, trusted contacts, and scheduled meetings for the diamonds trade had already been arranged. Frank, ever the obedient proxy, asked no questions. His role was simply to execute orders. Before departing Ottawa, Salazar tasked Frank with removing Rose's boyfriend, a young Italian man named Giorgio, from her life. Though Giorgio seemed to love Rose, reports indicated he had a serious gambling problem, which had recently drawn Rose into frequent visits to the Lac Limy casino in Gatineau. Salazar foresaw the danger. Once Rose's newfound wealth was in play, Giorgio's addiction would consume him, and he would inevitably come clawing for her money. Left to Charles, the young man would have been eliminated. However, Giorgio's only crime was being romantically involved with the wrong woman. Instead, Salazar instructed Frank to find a more discreet solution. With a fresh set of photos of Rose and one final glimpse of her through binoculars from her window, Charles departed, slipping back into his current life as a Hollywood actor. But in another decade or two, who knew what new identity he would adopt? He would once again start anew, crafting an entirely different persona from the ground up. He had long come to accept that the Indian Empress's so-called blessing was, in truth, a curse. Yet, after countless years of self-exploration, he understood the nature of existence. He no longer fought against the tides of time. He simply rode the current, guided by the self-imposed rules that safeguarded his privacy and freedom. Author's note: this fictionalized account of Charles the Great's immortal life stems from my deep admiration for Keanu Reeves. If one person on Earth were granted immortality, and it wasn't me, I would wish it to be Mr. Reeves. Immortality has always fascinated me. And while I recognize the grim realities such an existence could entail, I would still accept it without hesitation. In crafting this story, I allowed myself the liberty of inserting this mythical figure into various historical periods that I find both compelling and pivotal in the evolution of human civilization. My sole intention is to entertain. While certain historical names, facts, and timelines are accurate, I have taken significant creative liberties with the surrounding events. Hope you enjoyed this short story from the Unseen City. Salazar's Touch Volume 1. I took great pleasure in writing these stories, and though riddled in fiction and creativity, I owe the city Ottawa for its inspiration and its disposition.